Good morning and welcome to Immunic's third quarter 2021 earnings call. My name is Jessica Brew, Head of Investor Relations and Communications at Immunic. I will also be the moderator on today's call. Please note, all participants will be in listen-only mode and this event is being recorded. Speaking on today's call are Dr. Daniel Vitt, our Chief Executive Officer and President, as well as Glenn Whaley, our Vice President Finance and Principal Financial and Accounting Officer. After today's presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. If you joined the webcast via the Zoom client, there are two ways to submit your questions. You can either submit your questions in writing via the Q&A tool of the Zoom portal, or if you would like to speak with us directly, please use the raise hand function of the Zoom portal to queue your question. If you joined today's webcast by phone, please press *9 to queue your question. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that this presentation may contain forward-looking statements. Such statements can be identified by words such as may, will, expect, anticipate, estimate, or words with a similar meaning. And such statements involve a number of risks and uncertainties that could cause Immunic's actual results to differ materially from those discussed here. Please note that these forward-looking statements reflect Immunic's opinions only as of the date of this presentation, and it undertakes no obligation to revise or publicly release the result of any revision to these forward-looking statements in light of new information or future events. Please refer to Immunic's SEC filings for a more detailed description of the risk factors that may affect Immunic's results and these forward-looking statements. I now would like to turn the call over to our CEO and President, Dr. Daniel Vitt, to start with the presentation. Daniel, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica, for opening the call. I also would like to welcome everybody on Immunic's third quarter 2021 earnings call. Earlier this morning, we announced our financial results from the third quarter of 2021 and highlighted recent milestones as well as upcoming updates to our clinical development pipeline. During today's call, we will talk through our third quarter 2021 and subsequent highlights, financial and operating results, as well as anticipated milestones. Before we close the call, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. During the third quarter, we continued to make great progress in advancing our 3 product candidates through the clinic, setting the stage for several important data readouts in the fourth quarter of 2021 and 2022. Most importantly, we expect to start patient enrollment in our phase 3 program in relapsing multiple sclerosis still this quarter. Another major milestone will be the top-line data from our phase 2 trial in ulcerative colitis, which we anticipate in the second quarter of 2022. We just recently announced completion of patient recruitment with 263 patients randomized in total. For our second program, Immunic, we expect unblinded safety data from the single and multiple ascending dose parts of the phase 1 trial later this year. Additionally, we just have started part C of the phase 1 trial in psoriasis patients and expect initial human data from this patient population in the second quarter of next year. Finally, we also hope to see first clinical data from the ongoing phase 1 trial of IMU-856 in the third quarter of next year. But let me walk through the third quarter 2021 and subsequent highlights in more detail first. In July, we hosted a virtual R&D day to provide an update on the preclinical and clinical development of our ROR gamma T inverse agonist, Immunic. We presented very encouraging preclinical data showing that Immunic may inhibit both the generation of Th17 cells and the production of IL-17 cytokines that are responsible for the development of autoimmune diseases without impairing thymocyte development. We think that this may avoid a potential risk for lymphoma that has complicated third-party programs in this space. At the R&D day, we also presented further new preclinical data highlighting the potential of Immunic for the treatment of metastatic castration-resistant prostate cancer. Based on the strength of this data, we expect to initiate an open-label phase 1 dose escalation trial in CRPC during the fourth quarter of this year. Also in July, we successfully completed a $45 million follow-on offering, which extended our cash runway through multiple value inflection points into 2023. In September, we signed an in-license agreement with University Medical Center Göttingen in Germany, covering the combination of DHODH inhibitors and nucleoside analogs to treat viral infections. At the same time, we published remarkable preclinical data showing that certain DHODH inhibitors, including IMU-838, strongly synergize with selected nucleoside analogs to inhibit SARS-CoV-2 replication in vitro. This powerful reduction was demonstrated across multiple SARS-CoV-2 variants, including alpha, beta, and delta, and thereby highlighting the independence of this approach to mutant virus forms. I once again would like to thank our research partners at the University Medical Center Göttingen, Ruhr-University Bochum, Universitätsklinikum Erlangen, Utah State University, and MBM Science Bridge for their tremendous work. In September, we enrolled the first patient in our phase 2 CALIPER trial of IMU-838 in patients with progressive MS. The trial will run concurrently with our twin phase 3 ENSURE trials in relapsing MS and is thought to be a supportive trial to underline IMU-838's neuroprotective potential. We believe that if the trial is successful in showing a beneficial neuroprotective effect of IMU-838, we may be able to clearly differentiate IMU-838 versus other oral MS medications and carve out a very attractive commercial positioning in the MS landscape. In October, we are very pleased to welcome Patrick Walsh as our new Chief Business Officer. Patrick is a seasoned BD executive, and I very much look forward to leveraging his experience here at Immunic. In October, we also dosed the first psoriasis patient in Part C of our ongoing phase 1 trial of IMU-935. This represents the first time patients are treated with our oral IL-17 inhibitor, IMU-935. We expect initial psoriasis data in the second quarter of next year. October was a month of clinical milestones for Immunic. We also completed patient randomization in our phase 2 trial of IMU-838 in moderate to severe ulcerative colitis. In total, 263 patients were randomized. We now eagerly await the top-line data of the trial in the second quarter of next year. For the next part of our presentation, I would like to hand over to Glenn for the financial overview.
Thank you, Daniel. We will now review the financial and operating results for the third quarter of 2021. Let me start with the cash overview. We ended the quarter with $110 million in cash and cash equivalents, which we anticipate to be sufficient to fund operations into 2023. Now let's review the operating results. Research and development expenses in the third quarter were $15.5 million, as compared to $11 million for the same period in 2020. For the 9 months ended September 30th, R&D expenses were $42.7 million, as compared to $27.5 million for the same period in 2020. The increase in costs for both periods reflect a continued ramp-up of our clinical expenses related to our 3 clinical programs, as well as increased personnel expenses as a result of hiring more people to support the company's growth. The increases were partially offset by decreased costs related to our phase 2 clinical trial in COVID-19 that was finished in the first quarter of 2021, and decreases in drug supply costs for IMU-856. General and administrative expenses were $2.9 million for the 3 months ended September 30th, as compared to $2.5 million for the same period last year. For the 9 months ended September 30th, G&A expenses were $10 million, as compared to $7.3 million for the same period in 2020. The increase in costs for both periods was primarily due to non-cash stock compensation expense, as well as smaller increases in costs across numerous categories. Net loss for the third quarter 2021 was approximately $19.3 million, or 76 cents per share, based on 25.3 million weighted average common shares outstanding, compared to a net loss of approximately $12.9 million, or 70 cents per share, based on 18.4 million weighted average common shares outstanding for the same period in 2020. Net loss for the 9 months ended September 30th was approximately $71.8 million, or $3.33 per share, based on 21.6 million weighted average common shares outstanding, compared to a net loss of $32.9 million, or $2.35 per share, based on 14 million weighted average common shares outstanding for the same period in 2020. I would like to remind everybody that our year-to-date net loss was impacted by the settlement agreement of our subsidiary, Immunic AG, signed with 4SC AG in March of 2021. Immunic AG settled its remaining obligation of a 4.4% royalty on net sales of IMU-838 for $17.25 million. The payment was made 50% in cash, 50% in shares of Immunic's common stock. No further payment obligations remain between Immunic and 4SC AG. With that, I'll turn the call back over to Daniel for an outlook on our upcoming clinical milestones. Daniel?
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. As mentioned in the beginning of the call, we have a wealth of milestones coming up in the next couple of months, and I'm happy to walk you through these. Still in the fourth quarter of this year, we anticipate advancing IMU-838 into active phase 3 development, with the first relapsing MS patients expected to be dosed very soon. The ENSURE program comprises twin phase 3 designed to evaluate the efficacy, safety, and tolerability of IMU-838 in RMS patients. We have targeted an enrollment of approximately 1,050 patients in each trial. Dosing will be either 30 milligram daily dose of IMU-838 or placebo. The primary endpoint for both trials is time to first relapse up to 72 weeks. One of our biggest milestones in 2022 will be the readout of our phase 2 trial in patients with moderate to severe ulcerative colitis. We currently expect the top-line results of the induction phase to be available in the second quarter. For our phase 1 trial of IMU-935, we recently completed the experimental phase of the multiple ascending dose part in 15 healthy volunteers. We anticipate to receive unblinded safety, pharmacodynamic, and pharmacokinetic data from both the single and multiple ascending dose parts still in the fourth quarter of 2021. Also for IMU-935, we expect initial patient data from the third portion of the phase 1 trial in moderate to severe psoriasis to be available in the second quarter of 2022. For IMU-935, this will be a major value inflection point, as the data will provide us the first-time hints about IMU-935's safety and efficacy profile in a patient population. Staying a little bit with our IMU-935 program, in July, we announced that we anticipate to begin an open-label phase 1 dose escalation trial of IMU-935 in patients with progressive metastatic castration-resistant prostate cancer. The trial is designed to establish a recommended phase 2 dose and to assess safety, tolerability, anti-tumor activity, biomarkers, and pharmacokinetics of IMU-935 in CRPC. We were very honored that Professor Johan de Bono from Royal Marsden Hospital in London agreed to be the principal investigator of the trial. Just recently, we received approval by the relevant authorities in the UK to conduct the trial, which we expect to start in the fourth quarter of this year. Finally, we anticipate unblinding safety data from the single and multiple ascending dose parts of IMU-856 in healthy volunteers in the third quarter of 2022. Initiation of patient part of the phase 1 trial in intestinal barrier function associated diseases is expected in the first half of 2022. This brings me to the end of the presentation. Jessica, please open the call for the Q&A session.
Thank you, Daniel and Glenn, for walking us through the third quarter 2021 earnings presentation. We will now begin the question and answer session. As a reminder, if you joined the webcast via the Zoom client, there are two ways to submit questions. You can either submit your questions in writing via the Q&A tool of the Zoom portal, or if you would like to speak with us directly, please use the raise hand function of the Zoom portal to queue your question. If you joined today's webcast by phone, please press *9 to queue a question. For the Q&A session, we also have our broader management team on the call. In addition to Daniel and Glenn, we have Dr. Andreas Müller, our Chief Medical Officer, Patrick Walsh, our newly appointed Chief Business Officer, and Inderpal Singh, our General Counsel. At this time, we will pause momentarily to assemble our roster. The first question comes from Yasmin Rahimi at Piper Sandler. Yasmin, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Good morning, team. Thank you so much for taking my questions. I have a number for them. Maybe I would like to start off as we think about the CALDO study that is upcoming. So I think a frequent question that we're getting from our clients is to understand how we should be thinking about the composite endpoint, which is symptomatic remission and endoscopy healing. If you could provide us some color on what bar, in your view, is considered success. And then second, I would love to also learn a little bit more in terms of the clinical execution of reporting these histological and endoscopy reading, and then I have a follow-up.
Very good. Thank you, Yas, for the question. This is Andreas, the Chief Medical Officer. Regarding our CALDOS-1 trial in moderate to severe ulcerative colitis patient, yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think we use a composite endpoint that entails both symptomatic remission and endoscopic remission to be achieved at the same time at week 10. So when we designed the study, both regulators and also international clinical experts that we worked with had really indicated that we needed to find an endpoint that reduces the variability of the outcomes in placebo. It is known from the history of trials in IBD that there is some variability between trials in the placebo response, and patients actually can get better even under placebo, no treatment in this indication. And this variability has contributed to some of the failures of clinical trials in the past of drugs that we know to be active. So when we designed this trial, this composite endpoint was designed to minimize any placebo response. So we do expect a very low treatment response in the placebo group, but also I think this will have influence in what to expect in terms of the response in the active dose groups for IMU-838, when we have 3 dose groups, 10, 30, and 45 milligrams in this trial. So I think there should be the expectation that's very similar to very recent trials that have also used the composite endpoints, or very similar, even identical composite endpoints, where you see that the placebo response is below 10% or much below 10%, and the active treatment arms of these drugs that we know are active been found somewhere in the range of 15, 20, 25% for the active treatment arms. And I think that's also our expectations, that this would be a desired outcome and a good outcome for this kind of trial where we use this very stringent composite endpoint in order to reduce the variability of placebo. So that's your first question, yes. And the second question, the clinical execution of endoscopy and histology. So as with many other trials, I think it's now state of the art that the endoscopy, the screening endoscopy, but also we have endoscopies, of course, at week 10 for the primary endpoint, and we have an endoscopy at week 50 at the end of the double-blind maintenance period after the induction, after remission was achieved. that all of those endoscopies are done by a central blinded reader. So this is not done locally, but it is done by a central blinded reader. And there was also an adjudication of the week 10 endoscopy. That means that they have been read at least twice. And if they're not concurrent, then an adjudication was done. So I think this is what we've done, I believe is really state of the art to what's currently done in IBD trials. In terms of histology, we have a histology assessment at screening at week 10 and at week 50 that will allow us to do a GITA score. That's also the histology score that's used. That, of course, is also done in a blinded fashion, which is, of course, much easier because it's done often by it has to be done by a central lab that is completely independent of the execution of the trial. Hopefully, yes, I addressed your questions.
No, that was that was perfect. Thank you, Andreas. And maybe one more follow-up for you would be, will you be reporting a top line also just the individual rates for clinical remission? And then the second question is, as we are awaiting the data from the SAD and MAT portion of 935, should we be looking at certain biomarkers that will help us sort of provide translation into the 1B psoriasis cohort? And thank you again for taking my long list of questions.
Yeah, no, that's fine, yes. So I think for, we will, for the UC trial, the CALDOS-1 trial, we will, of course, the top line data will not only include the primary data, but it also includes the individual rates of clinical remission, clinical improvement, and endoscopic improvement, endoscopic remission. So I think there will be these individual data as well, not just the composite data. I think because also I think it provides a better understanding of comparability to other UC drugs and phase 2 trials. So I think that for us was important as well to be part of the top line data. In terms of 935, that's a very good question. Do we have in the part A and B that includes healthy volunteers any chance to have biomarkers that will hint on efficacy or an activity in the psoriasis part later on? I have to say that's very difficult. We have thought about this quite a lot, and it's very difficult to do because you would have to look at, for example, cytokines or some other biomarkers that are not elevated in these healthy volunteers because they're very carefully selected to be really healthy volunteers and have no medical history and so forth. So unfortunately, I have to say, I don't think with the data that we will present to you before the end of the year in terms of the safety, pharmacokinetics, unblinded laboratory findings and so forth, I don't think that will give too much credence on efficacy activity readouts. So I don't think that's possible with this healthy volunteer population.
Thank you so much for taking my question.
Thank you, Yas. Our next question comes from Gobind Singh at JMP. Gobind, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, is this working?
Yes.
Wonderful, thanks. So two from me. First on IMU 838 in progressive MS. Wondering if there's if you have any comments about the recent hype from large pharma to kind of develop their own BTK in this space, and also RMS, of course. But if why BTKs in MS and now, and is there any relation to neurofilaments and what have we seen there? And is there any way to kind of use that as a bar for what could be coming from the interim readout from the Caliper trial? And then one follow-up from me.
Hi, Gobind. Thanks for the question. This is Andreas again, Chief Medical Officer. So I think in terms of the BTK, we're carefully looking, of course, at the BTK inhibitors and how they present themselves in this space, especially in progressive MS, but also in general in the MS space. And to be quite honest, I think I've seen the presentations by the companies developing it, and at the moment, they're focusing very much on still the immune component of their reaction and the upregulation of the BTK in immune-related cells in the brain, which surprised a little bit because I think if you want to develop this for secondary progressive, you have to my mind or to our mind, you have to address also mechanisms of disability worsening that are unrelated primarily unrelated to the immune system. So I think the BTK inhibitors have focused on microglia, for example. We believe that the mechanism of action of IMU-838 is much broader than that and can address different things that of course involves, for example, antiviral effects. It involves also having an effect on which is known for other DHODH inhibitors on actually the metabolic status, especially and mitochondrial stress in actually neuronal cells, so non-immune related cells, which I think we believe is contributing to a efficacy in a phase of MS that's not primarily driven by immune mechanisms. So in that respect, I see clear difference in the way that IMU-838 can act in secondary progressive MS or in primary progressive MS than the BTK inhibitors. On the other thing, I feel very strongly that our safety profile that we have shown in phase 2 in the relapsing remitting, and also that we see now in the continued open label phase of this phase 2 study, and we have more than 200 patients of this phase 2 trial still on drug, still on treatment in this open label portion. And we see very little drop off in basically patients on treatment, which we take as a very good sign in terms of the general tolerability profile for this drug. So I think we feel very strongly that we can achieve a very good differentiation versus BTK inhibitors, even in this progressive MS population.
One follow-up on that. Have we seen with any of the BTKs what it's doing on neurofilament? And then on the open label part of the trial, might we see any updated data longer term, perhaps improvements in neurofilament? I believe the last results you guys presented there was almost, about a 20% reduction compared to placebo. Might we see an update in the open label this year? And then one follow-up on COVID-19, with everything going around with Merck and the excitement there, and the data that you guys have presented in the combo setting, ex vivo, for the potentially improved reduction in SARS-CoV-2, is there anything there that you can comment on at this point about maybe resuming clinical development or otherwise?
Yeah, Gobind, so just the question for you, basically neurofilament. I have to here in public present ignorance on my part that I don't really have a good understanding of what neurofilament is doing in BTK inhibitors. So I know you're very interested in it, and I'll do my best to update myself a little bit better next time. And maybe for the question about the synergistic effect between DHODH with other drugs in the COVID setting, I would hand over to Daniel.
Yeah, I think we just recently announced, and you have seen we signed this collaboration or a licensing agreement with University Göttingen, and it was based on exactly that synergy observed. We think the potential is broad and goes definitely beyond COVID-19. So I think this principle should be used on a broader level on targeting antiviral or having new antiviral, very potent antiviral treatments. However, we clearly said in the past already that we are not planning to go ahead in a phase 3 with 828 in COVID-19, and we didn't change our plans here. I think we are focusing the company really on the important things here. We are still interested in the combination and in the antiviral properties, but that should be done in a collaboration or in an independent way forward. And I'm not in a position to give more details on the discussion status here, but I think clearly there is an interest in this world in potent antivirals, and there will be a way forward for that molecule, but it's unlikely that we start in clinical trials soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Govind. Our next question comes from Thomas Smith at SVB Leerink. Thomas, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, everyone. This is Mike on for Tom. Can you hear me all right?
Yes. Hi, Mike.
Sure.
Hi there. Thanks for taking our questions. Two on our end. The first is just, can you provide some color on how you're thinking of the overall competitive landscape in IBD, and specifically what kind of impact you see the recent labeling updates for the JAK inhibitors having? And I have a follow-up.
Well, it's a mixture of question for Andreas and myself. Of course, it's an interesting time in that space, and specifically given that, that's not a secret that the FDA had some questions around safety and tolerability of JAK inhibitors recently. So that's of course impacting the whole set of therapy developments in that space. And for us, it underlines that there's a high unmet medical need. We nicely fit in. And just to repeat, and I mentioned that in our company presentations a couple of times, A38 provides something from a mode of action point of view, something new for patients with ulcerative colitis, which is on the one hand, being a selective immunoregulator and targeting specifically hyperactivated immune cells. On the other hand, having antiviral properties, protecting patients from viral reactivations. I think these are two features which are urgently needed from patients in that space. Not sure, Andreas, if you want to add some more color on the competitive landscape from your point of view, just from the medical point of view. Maybe.
No, yes, and of course, when we started the phase 2 program for IMU-838, there was when we talked to our medical advisors and experts, there was, of course, they had a lot of focus on the JAK inhibitors because they had an advantage to the market in establishing this new category of these novel immune modulators that are between the traditional immunomodulators and the biologics. And what I've seen now is really, I think that with more and more drugs coming, there was the hope that what's called more selective JAK inhibitors would behave differently or would have less challenges, which I think in general didn't materialize. And so I think the whole class of drugs really has, to the different degrees, of course, the different drugs, but have the same, I think, reputational problem then also for the medical community. We also have seen that there was, especially about the JAK inhibitors, a lot of discussions about the increases of infections during treatment and virus reactivations, especially zoster reactivations. And I think we clearly see here that our antiviral properties that really has helped us, that we have in our clinical trials never seen an increase of infections and infestations versus placebo. We have not seen these viral reactivations. And in that respect, we feel very strongly that the time advantage that these JAK inhibitors had coming into the market will not play out well for them, to my mind. And we have a very good chance to, with IMU-838, to create a very successful drug in ulcerative colitis.
Got it. That's very helpful. Thanks. And then just quickly, with respect to the MS program, has anything changed recently in the phase 3 trial assessment? And how do you plan on mitigating the potential impact of COVID in the study?
So I'm not sure anything has changed. No, I'm just thinking what you could mean, because we are just executing as quickly as possible the plans that we had. So I think it's a very large program. It's also these phase 3 programs are very complex in terms of the different assessments with different vendors that you have to do. So I think our team does extremely good work in terms of preparing these phase 3 trials. So, but nothing has changed in the execution of the phase 3 trials.
Maybe just on COVID, I think we talked about it, given that we have seen antiviral properties of 838. we clearly see not a big issue with the ongoing COVID pandemic on recruitment. That's priced in basically in our estimates.
I think we have the experience from the CALDOS trial, the IMU-838 trial in ulcerative colitis, that of course had a lot of activity during the whole COVID period. And yes, there are a few sites usually that makes monitoring harder, and also that we have accessibility problems for patients. But this was really, I think, very minimal on our part, the COVID impact on IMU-838, because we had been in very close contact with all of the investigators during the COVID period, highlighting the broad antiviral property. At a time when we didn't know that we had actually activity in COVID-19, as we found out later on with the CALDO trial, we focused that this does not put patients at risk, like many other immunomodulators, but that actually put patients at risk, which is very well known now for a more severe course of the COVID-19 disease. And once we had the CALDO data in COVID patients, we actually also informed them that that we have seen some activity in this trial that would support that we actually might be helpful for these patients in case they get infected. So I think this all had very good, I think, assurance to the investigators that they should continue this trial. And that's what we had seen, at least in the CALDOS trial. And we, of course, take preventive measures, especially in terms of providing study drug to patients when they're not allowed to access the site. But in terms of enrollment, I don't think we see a significant impact, even with maybe a more robust infection numbers in the future here in this winter for COVID-19.
Great, thanks very much, and congrats on the progress.
Thank you, Thomas.
Mike.
Thank
you, Mike. So our next two questions come from Zach Bajala at Roth Capital, and I will actually read them because they came in via the Q&A tool. First question: most of indications being pursued by Immunic, including MS, UC, psoriasis, etc., and even your investigator-sponsored studies like MCRPC are all blockbuster indications. However, they are also indications for which there are multiple competing drugs. You've shown success in MS. How are you thinking about competitiveness of your programs in UC and psoriasis?
Well, this is a very important strategic question for the company. And first of all, I agree with the success in the MS space. That's a good problem to have. They are big indications. And I think the company is addressing high unmet medical need. We may not be in a position to continue with all the programs through phase 3 our own. So it's likely something where we are open for partnering. And in that context, you can also see that we just recently strengthened the team with Patrick Walsh joining us in October as Chief Business Officer to balance the exposure here and also strengthening our discussions here with potential pharmas for the future. But of course, these are big markets and they are driven by big unmet medical need.
The second question is about our interest in partnerships, and are you likely to also independently take your UC and psoriasis programs into phase 3 like you have with your MS program, or are you open to partnering ahead of the initiation of pivotal studies?
Patrick, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, happy to, and good morning, everyone. This is Patrick Walsh. I'll summarize it this way, in that we are actively exploring many options across the portfolio, and we have not made any decisions with respect to the types of arrangements that we will or won't consider, but certainly excited about the evolution of the data for all of our programs here. So looking forward to that.
Thank you, Patrick. Just as a reminder, if you have a question, please use the raise hand function of the Zoom portal, or if you joined by phone, please press *9. Our next question comes from Matt Kaplan at Ladenburg Thalmann. Matt, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hey, Matt.
Great. Thanks for taking the questions. Just a couple of questions. First, a follow-up on Yasmin's question in terms of the SAD and MAD data for 935. I guess not that we're looking for a read through to the psoriasis, but can you describe the PD data that we should be looking for as that reads out later this year?
So, Matt, are you meaning what's in the part A and B that we're announcing?
No, just from a pharmacodynamic point of view. What are some of the things you're looking for? Not really beyond PK, I guess, in the SAD/MAD data.
So pharmacokinetic, of course, data we will have extensively, because we, of course, in this part A and B, we did single dose pharmacokinetic. We had multiple dose pharmacokinetic over 14 days in these patients. And these were healthy volunteers, sorry. We also explored different dosing options, once daily versus twice daily, I think, to see how they address certain needs, for example, or how they would allow us certain configurations for these patients. So both are done. And we also, in this part A and B, did evaluation of food effect, for example, on the pharmacokinetic. So that's what you should expect all to come. And I think I just have to stress what I told you. Yes, I think the amount of pharmacodynamic data that you can get that is relevant to really our indication and that exceeds what we had done in vitro, because we had done the in vitro data with human lymphocytes and release based on different concentrations of Immunic 935. So this was done in vitro, and we felt that there's very little that you can do in healthy volunteers that would exceed really the value of the in vitro experiments that we had done with human lymphocytes.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. And then a second question, just wanted to focus a little bit on your other program, IMU 856, which targets the intestinal barrier function. Can you give us a sense in terms of what role this molecule could play and what indications you're excited about potentially pursuing after you announce the SAD and MAD data, I guess, in the third quarter of next year?
Yeah, I think Matt, these are very good questions. So the thing with and you know this as well as I do, that the mechanism of action addresses the barrier dysfunctions in the gut that is responsible for so many diseases, symptoms, and pathophysiology for different diseases. Yes, and that's as much as good news as bad news. Yes, because I think the company has to focus to find its indication where we believe we can show proof of concept relatively quickly with the 28-day dosing, similar to psoriasis, where you have a medical need and where you also have the ability to execute quickly towards with endpoints that are accepted by the FDA. And with this discussion is ongoing, but I think I can promise you we have a lot of these interesting discussions, and we will relatively soon present our plans for that. But at the moment, we haven't fully been able to make this public yet.
Okay, fair enough. Well, thanks for taking the questions, and congrats on all the progress.
Thank you, Matt. Next question comes from Boobalan Pachaiyappan at H.C. Wainwright. Boobalan, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Okay, awesome. So thanks for taking my question, just few from our end. So just curious to hear your thoughts on NFL, especially these two questions. So firstly, how do NFL levels in RRMS patients compare with healthy adults? And secondly, do you think utilizing NFL as a biomarker may streamline patient recruitment for your upcoming ENSURE trial and maybe future pivotal trials in advanced MS patients?
Hi, Boobalan. This is Andreas again, the Chief Medical Officer. So I think this goes way beyond Immunic, yes, because I think not only the MS community, but the community of doing clinical research in neurodegenerative diseases, this is beyond MS, had really found that the biomarker neurofilament correlates to the amount of damage to neurons and independent necessarily independent of the disease process that's involved. And we have seen this in several diseases, and in MS also we've seen a very good correlation, not just in our trial but also in other trials in the last years, that the treatment effect in preventing the damage to neurons and neurons dying and having less lesions and having less relapse activity always translates into neurofilament. So that and we have shown this just with the ECTRIMS poster in I think 2 months ago or last month, that it correlated very well with the patients who had relapse. For example, in our phase 2 trial, had more of a more resistance to NFL decrease than patients who didn't have a relapse. But you're also asking a good question, because I think there's a predictability. It doesn't mean that there's not overlap in the individual patient. So I think NFL is a good marker for groups in terms of or populations in terms of therapy control or a therapy relation to success of therapy. But we have also seen that, and that we have also published in this ECTRIMS poster, is that those patients who at baseline, for example, at start of therapy, have a relatively high neurofilament, that they're having more activity in a trial. They tend to have more activity, but it's also a little bit more, this is a prediction and may not help you on the individual patient level, but on the population, that's true. We will not use a stratification or a inclusion-exclusion criteria for neurofilament in the phase 3, because we believe, I think also that what we have seen from the phase 2 data is this, and that was part of the part of the poster as well, that the treatment effect of IMU-838 is independent of what baseline neurofilament level you have. So I think it would unnecessarily diminish our phase 3 population, we don't need to basically enrich a more active or a more a population that is expected to have more relapses for this trial, we believe. So it's something that is a very good marker for damage to neurons, and especially you come back to your last question in terms of progressive MS. There are, over the last 1 or 2 years, and this ECTRIMS again last month was also no exception, there are now more data, because I think the marker started with relapsing MS data, but we have now more data in progressive MS, and they absolutely mirror what we know from relapsing MS, that neurofilament also is a very good treatment predictor and correlates with activity of drugs in secondary progressive, and patients who have a more aggressive form of progressive MS have a higher neurofilament in serum than those patients who have a less severe disability progression or brain atrophy. And this has been shown over and over again. So it thinks this is a real effect, and that's why we're also using neurofilament as part of our interim analysis for our Caliper trial. And we believe that this could be predictive in terms of the overall results to expect at the end of the trial.
Thanks, Andreas. That's really, really helpful. So your CALDOS-1 study has completed enrollment. So what are your baseline expectations for this trial? And what would be the minimum placebo-adjusted clinical remission rate you'd like to see to carry the program forward? And do you think the CALDOS-1 results impact the upcoming Crohn's disease trial?
So I think, I know that's a very good question in terms of whether you have a hard threshold or a hard parameter on which to decide whether to go forward in phase 3. Usually, I think these phase 3 decisions are not related to statistical significance or to a certain outcome, or I think you need to justify it on the entirety of the data, because I think there's also some benefit risk that you have to consider, where you have to put the safety versus the gain and efficacy or activity that you see. So I personally think that you need to look at the entirety of data. For example, I just want to remind you of the phase 2 trial in tofacitinib by Pfizer. There was really, I think, as far as I remember, there was no statistically significant outcome in the primary or key secondary outcomes. And clearly it's an active drug in UC. And Pfizer took it forward. So I think the expectation should be really to look at the entirety of the data and make an assessment of benefit risk, and also what the dosing level is that is supported by activity and the safety. And so far what we have seen, I think we have, and that's what is true for the phase 2 study in MS, that we could have taken any of our doses forward that we had in phase 2 in terms of safety, but yeah, then you have to decide what's the lowest effective dose that should be going to phase 3. And that's how we chose the 30 milligram dose. It was not a assessment of a certain statistical outcome from the phase 2, to be quite honest. So it was, I think, more considerations done, but I think the outcome, of course, in the main efficacy endpoints, of course, have a huge effect on how this benefit risk is. But I think it's wrong to have it's not advised to have a very hard criterion for that, to my mind.
Okay, awesome. One last one from me. So what are some of the gating items remaining to initiate the GBS program, Guillain-Barré syndrome? And where do you see opportunities for value creation, given there are multiple players in the clinical development space? Thank you.
So maybe this is more an overall question for the pipeline and the balance, and we decided to park it for a little bit because we have identified CRPC as a very attractive indication, and we prioritize CRPC a little bit over GBS. And given that we will see data from the SAD MAD safety part towards end of the year, and first efficacy hints from the psoriasis patient cohort in the second quarter next year, coming from psoriasis, I think this will help us to get the full picture, and also will help us on supporting going forward, for example, in GBS as well.
Okay, thanks so much for taking my question. Greatly appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Boobalan. Our next question comes from Andreas Argyrides at Wedbush. Andreas, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
All right, good morning, and thank you for taking our questions. Just a quick one, and that was a nice segue from the prostate cancer program 935. Can you provide additional color on the study, and such as how many doses will be assessed at the start of the trial? What biomarkers do you plan on measuring? Thanks.
Yes, hi Andreas. I think it was a little bit lower volume, I think, than the rest. So I just say repeat the question for if somebody had a hard time hearing the question. So you want a little bit more color how the study will be done in CRPC for IMU 935. So this, first of all, in general, this study will have a dose escalation part. That means that we have several cohorts where we try to escalate the dose and potentially find a dose limiting of toxicity. This is something that we have not done in the phase 1 trial, in the general phase 1 trial for IMU 935, because we know that the dose limiting toxicity is way beyond the therapeutic necessary doses for immunology diseases. So in that respect, this will be different, of course, for the oncology indication, where you have to try to dose up to the dose limiting toxicity. So this will be done with several cohorts. We don't know how many. So this depends a little bit of course, how quickly you find that dose limiting toxicity, or whether you not find it. We have a maximum dose also identified where we will stop, because it's we believe that you don't need to go beyond that. And then we have a second part that's a expansion part, where we take 1 or 2 doses that we identified as potential phase 2 doses, or that basically are where we have seen maybe some hint of activity in the dose escalation part, to expand cohorts to allow a more thorough assessment of activities in these dose parts. The study will look at biochemical markers, of course, PSA, yes, as a biochemical output. We are looking at imaging. We're looking at circulating tumor cells. So everything that you know about prostate cancer, and especially about castrate-resistant prostate cancer from the Prostate Cancer Working Group, now recommendation 3, I think we have implemented. So I think when you read the Prostate Cancer Working Group document, you basically find the biomarker that we're also looking at. We're following the recommendations, as Johan de Bono is one of the authors of this Prostate Cancer Working Group document, and really had set the guidelines. I think you more or less have to follow these these guidelines then.
Great. All right. Appreciate the color. Thanks, and congrats on all the progress.
Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you, Andreas. This concludes our question and answer session. I would like to turn the call back over to Daniel for any closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica, and thank you all for the great questions and the lively discussion today here. Very much enjoyed that. I hope you can feel our excitement about the operational progress Immunic has made this year and the multiple catalysts to come in the next couple of months. We very much look forward to seeing clinical data from our clinical programs next year, in particular the phase 2 data of IMU-838 in ulcerative colitis and the initial patient data from IMU-935, both in the second quarter of next year. With this, I would like to close today's call. Thank you very much for joining, and we are very happy to answer any additional questions in one-on-ones.
Also from my side, thank you for joining Immunic's third quarter 2021 earnings call today. The conference has now concluded. You may now disconnect.